In this section, we're talking about the persistence of racialized societies. We have established that race is not a biologically valid way to categorize a species. That is, it doesn't say something valid. Your skin color doesn't say something valid about your intelligence or your other abilities. It is simply not a good way to describe human biological variation. However, the categories that we have decided relatively recently in human history, in the last 500 years, that we would group people into have had enormous social impacts. Some of these impacts were encoded in laws, laws that made people stay in certain places, or decided whom you could marry, or if you could get married at all. In our world, for the most part, we hope, many of those laws, those explicit legal claims, have been abolished. People like to think that we are now beyond all that. And they say funny things like, oh, I don't see color. We are not beyond all that. These things persist in our society because they are deeply embedded in our social fabric. Again, this is not because it is a biologically valid claim. However, the effects of these ideas can have a biological effect. They can make you have more hypertension. They can contribute to higher maternal death rates and can result in shorter lifespans. So they do have a biological effect, even if race itself is not a biologically valid category. Racism is an ideology. Like other ideologies, it is a belief system. It is then imposed upon other people, or we enact it in our daily actions without even realizing many times. The idea of racialization is that we first categorize people into these typologies. So even though it may be illegal to discriminate, for example, when you are renting your house, we nevertheless categorize people into these typologies, and it influences our behavior and what people are able to do in their lives. In general, what we have done in our society is we have institutionalized the advantages for certain groups, and people seek to maintain those advantages. Now, they might not actively be racist people in order to benefit from a racialized system. Schools, for example. Schools in this country are in general funded by property taxes. Property taxes are on the basis of how much your house is worth. For most people, this is the single largest purchase they will make in their lives. And our neighborhoods are very stratified by how much wealth you have. The wealthier the neighborhood, the more they pay in property taxes, the better the schools are likely to be. Wealth in this country is also very stratified statistically. Again, I'm not saying there aren't poor white people or rich black people. Of course there are. But statistically speaking, on average, the average white household, there's different numbers that are given for the wealth disparities, but has something in the range of 6 times to 12 times, maybe more, the average wealth of a comparable black household. If you have that much more average wealth, which is often in the form of your house, your schools are going to be better. Now, I do not have to be individually racist to want my kids to go to the best schools they can and thus try to move into one of these neighborhoods if I can afford it. However, that is contributing to, or it is helping to institutionalize a system in which some people have access to better education opportunities. Again, I didn't have to call anybody any names. I didn't have to have bad attitudes in my head, but the system is sorting things out so that my kids are getting an advantage in their education because I have been able to buy into, based on my wealth, a wealthier school district. Am I going to condemn anybody who tries to do that? Of course not. Of course you would try to do that. Of course you would try to move into the best place you can. However, we should recognize that that is what keeps our society, or that's one of the things that perpetuates or in which our society reproduces itself. You have probably heard the term racism. However, interestingly, and I'm glad your textbook brings this up, some of this is perpetuated through what they call colorism. Colorism, which you may not have heard before, but maybe some of you have. It's a preference for lighter skinned people who seem to have the characteristics that are associated with whiteness. And this happens in many different places because the US standard has been shipped around the world. It often comes about that people are buying products in order to lighten their skin or change their hair form or lighten their hair. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry around the world to for people to try and get access to these kinds of things. It also can be a very dangerous industry. This picture from your textbook is from the Philippines, where they are trying to, this was called a Miss Poison Mercury pageant, in which they are trying to draw attention to the fact that these ideas that you should lighten your skin are causing people to get mercury poisoned because some of these products are very dangerous. So, this is something that happens not just in our own society, but it occurs in many different societies. Colorism is a way in which people grade themselves and others in relationship to proximity to white characteristics. And this is a deep, this is a deep social thing, which also interestingly is not just something that is done. Usually we think of racism as a white-black thing, but colorism is something that also occurs within Black and Latina communities. There have been educational seminars. I'm pulling a flyer from one of these. This is a series for Black and Latinx community members, talking to people about the influence of colorism within their own community. So this is something that people do within their own places or their own groups. A lot of this has some very painful histories and is very complicated. But yeah, you will see this in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect. Cuba, for example, and we're supposed to have this revolution that made everybody equal. But if you look at the leadership of the revolution and who came out on top, it's light-skinned people all the way. And if you look at Cuban society, it's a huge marginalization of and anti-blackness within that society. And it certainly carries over into the Cuban migrant community or the Cuban immigrant communities in Florida and elsewhere. It's a very deep thing. White people do this too. We don't always realize it because in this country we were taught to divide people between two races. But if the psychologists have done experiments where they will show people pictures of two individuals, both of which would be classified as black in this country. One of them is a light-skinned African American or a light-skinned black, and one of them is a dark-skinned black. And then they will tell you the crime that this person supposedly committed. They will give you these pictures and they will say, this person, it's the exact same crime. And people are more likely to assign to assign a harsher sentence to the darker skinned person than the lighter skinned person for the same crime. And even though technically they would be considered part of the same racial group in our society. So this is something that is done within some of these communities, and also it is done by the dominant society as well, although people don't always realize That's what they're doing. So it's a good thing to understand. In our country, we don't really do this. We don't officially do a color gradient. We do, however, on many of our documents, put a racial category. I was thinking probably many of our birth certificates have a racial category on them. You're walking around with one of these things in your pocket all the time, a document that is specifying what race you supposedly belong to. This happens as well every 10 years when every person in the United States is asked to fill out a census form. And it's interesting what the census form demands that we say to them. You don't have to answer these questions, but if you don't do it, someone will come around and ask you what they are. There are only a certain number of mandatory questions, but in our country, the census asks us to classify our race. Interestingly, in the words of the census, anything Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin is not considered a race, which goes against how many people in the United States see race. A lot of people would see Mexican, for example, as a different race, but in terms of the census, that is classified as an either or. Yes or no, are you Hispanic? In part, that is because if you look, as I was just talking about the example of Cuba, in many Latin American countries, there is a very large range of people from very light-skinned who have a lot of European descent to very dark-skinned who have a lot of African descent. So if you look at Colombia, for example, where I did my field work in South America, very light-skinned people, down to what they call Afro-Colombians, who were some of them were imported as enslaved and others were escaped from that very early on in the coastal regions. In any case, when people come to this country and from other Latin American countries, from Latin American countries, they are often asked to fit into our existing racial system. Our existing racial system was mostly divided between white and black and has a lot to do with enslavement and a history of plantation slavery and who was supposed to be working on those plantations. If you look at question 9, when we do ask about race, the two big categories on there are white and black. And then we have a bunch of other boxes. In the old days, before the year 2000, you were not allowed to check more than one box or write multi. You had to be one or the other. And oftentimes it was the census taker who decided. You didn't even get to decide. The census taker came to your door and decided for you. In 2000 was the first year in this country that we allowed people to check off more than one box. Now we're asking them to print things. It was the first year, the year 2000, in this country, it wasn't that long ago that you could only choose one race on the census. I was a census taker that year. I went to people's houses and I asked them these questions. Super interesting job. If you can, if you have a spare summer in 2030, the next time we'll do it. And I remember going to this one house, and the woman answered the door, and first you go through the demographics, and she's like, "I have a son. I live here with my son." And then I get to the race questions. And I said, "Well, what race are you?" And she says, "I'm black." And I said, "Well, what race is your son?" And she says, "Well, his father's white." And I said, "Well, do you want me to check off white and black?" And she said, "He's considered black. Because in this country, if you have one black parent, you are considered black. It doesn't matter, you know. That didn't matter." And I said, "Well, should I check off black?" I was willing to do whatever she said. And she said, "Well, his father's white." I said, "Well, should I check off white and black?" We got into kind of a little dance because what she was saying is again an issue that our racial categories are not corresponding to what is biologically going on out there in the world. People are always mixing up, and they have always been mixing up and will keep getting mixed up, and their physical traits are not an indication of anything else. However, we slot them into categories, and in the before 2000, that would have definitely been check the black box because you only got to check one box. That was what this person was saying to me, was that in our society, this person is considered black. And there were people who in that census said, no, I'm going to, even though I know that I have mixed racial heritage, I am going to check black because it's a dilution of it. That's what our society is saying about me. Other people decided to check both of those boxes, which is what the woman eventually decided to do for her son. So it was different. Policing. If you look historically at the origins of the police system itself, it had a lot to do with enslavement and making sure that people who were trying to escape the system got caught and returned. So a lot of our policing and a lot of our codes and a lot of our laws and a lot of our violations of laws, for example, sundown cities, where if you were black, you were not allowed to be within city limits after a certain time. A lot of these things are persist with us, even though some of these laws have been abolished. Statistically, yes, there are differential rates of people being stopped and differential rates of sentencing and differential rates of imprisonment. We live in a society that has one of the highest rates of imprisonment in the entire industrialized world. Never seen so many prisons in modern human history. Maybe in human history, we have more percentage of our people in prisons than almost anywhere. It's a huge industry, prisons. There's whole towns that live off of having a prison next to them. Well, in the old days, it was considered that if you went to prison, you were supposed to then pay for your crimes and get rehabilitated and rejoin society. But we have often again, prison is such an industry that we put people in it. And how often do people come out of prison and you're like, oh yeah, I'll hire you. I love hiring felons. It's something that's a problem. We strip them of the right to vote so often, again, if you have this differential rate of incarceration. You mentioned a very radical movement, which people get very up in arms about, but it's worth discussing. It's called abolition. It's like we need to rethink our whole prison system. Now, obviously, we don't want a bunch of violent people out on the streets, but we have to remember that many of the people that are currently incarcerated are serving time for crimes that may not even be crimes now. There's a differential between our policing system and our prison system. Again, this is not to get down on anyone individually who wants to be a part of this. It's important, but we do have to realize the history and the differential that has been done. Often our schools it's odd because in the 1950s, as you may know, there was the Brown v. Board of Education and official legal desegregation of our schools. It is not legal to have a white-only school. That is not permitted by law, and there have been efforts made to integrate our schools. However, again, if you look statistically at our country, the percentage, our schools are as segregated percentage-wise as they were 60 or 70 years ago, as they were during Brown v. Board of Education. Now, there's no law that says to do that, but it has to do with how wealth is allocated in our society, property taxes, and who moves to where. And the fact that when schools got desegregated, all of a sudden all these private schools popped up and people started sending their kids to private schools instead of public schools. We've had a defunding of the public school system, and the result is that many students live in schools that are tremendously segregated by race. Everyday interactions, comments that people make, little jabs, what are sometimes called microaggressions. These happen all the time. People sometimes aren't even aware that they are doing them. Sometimes people are aware and they use them as weapons against people who, when they're not expecting it, you get hit with a comment. This is an example that your textbook talks about of what linguists call mock Spanish, el cheapo. There is no word in Spanish for el cheapo, but what this is it's meant to be funny. And people who use this type of language, which is not language, uses these type of expressions, often want to be seen as easygoing and cool. But these expressions rely on stereotypes about primarily Mexican Americans, but about Latinos in general, that they're cheap, that they're lazy. These everyday interactions in schools, on the streets, in our homes can reinforce or can serve to perpetuate our racialized system. In the last class, I talked about Gary, Indiana. There's a picture from that place. And I was thinking about Gary, Indiana a little bit more because I remember my first encounter with Gary, Indiana. I was driving out of Chicago with my dad. We're driving toward the East Coast. I was about 15 years old. We'd been staying with some people in Chicago and we were driving east about 30 miles through to Gary, Indiana. And the people we were staying with said, when you go past Gary, roll up your windows and hold your nose. It stinks. And sure enough, when we drove by, you could smell it. But I didn't know why. Later on, I've been teaching this forensic osteology article talking about the contrast between the percentage of white people in Iowa, which is about 90%, and the percentage of black people in Gary, Indiana, which is about 90%. And if you found bones in one location, you would classify them as white. What if you found bones in the other location, you would classify them as black, even though they're the same bones? I hadn't really thought about how the history of how these things happened. And I'm glad I didn't think about the history of why it is that Gary, Indiana smelled bad at the time. The thing is that Gary, Indiana was established by U.S. Steel in 1906 to build the biggest steel mill that you could possibly find. It was named after the company chairman, Judge Albert H. Gary. And for many years, it was a huge place where people loved to live and work in what was the biggest steel plant in the country. This was a great place, and it provided much of the steel, much of the things that make America a great place. Our cars, our bridges, our factories, our airplanes, all of these things came from this giant steel plant in Gary, Indiana. But what happened with the collapse of the US steel industry and the decline of US steel production? It has left Gary, Indiana with a very impoverished population who came here for industrial jobs and a lot of environmental pollution and toxicity in the air and general environment. Now, it's better than when I was there 30 years ago. However, when we think about places in our own country and in other societies that look like they are in very bad shape and are often racialized because the people who went to go work these jobs, sometimes willingly, but sometimes not so willingly, had to do some very hard work in terrible conditions and often ended up poisoning themselves and their own children in order that many other people could enjoy the benefits of steel or gold or silver or industrial production or cars or today in today's world iPhones and computers and all the great electronic stuff we have. Now, it relates to what we're going to be talking about in chapter 16, because you will see this pattern again and again, where people will go into an area and say, oh, this place has a lot of silver in it. I really want to mine the silver to get my currency out of it. I'm going to bring in thousands of enslaved people in order to mine this place, and they take all the wealth out of it and leave the place an industrial environmental disaster. And then we have all the silver, and we're like, cool, I love silver stuff, I love silver money, but the place has been left in ruins. Or in the sugar plantations, 4 million Africans approximately were dragged to Brazil in order to plant sugar, harvest sugar in the sugar plantations. Again, this often resulted in the sugar being shipped into the rest of the world, and the sugar became a big commodity. However, it leaves those places, and it's left many of those places impoverished, and plantation sugar is very hard on the soil. And working in a sugar plantation was one of the most dangerous jobs you could do. The average work lifespan of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was 7 years. So it was a very harsh condition, but it fueled the world economy and the workers in Europe who were drinking sugar sweetened beverages. That's why the English like lots of sugar in their tea, at least the working classes. So this is I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a story that we will learn more about in chapter 16, which talks about industry, environment, indigenous populations, and the effects on our world today.